Willkommen in einen anderen aufregendes video, or welcome to another exciting video. This is a part 39 of my game system design series, and in this case I'll investigate in converting a board game into a Micro-Armour figure game. Its advantages, its disadvantages, and why it's so rare, and why many modern rules represent a hybrid between these two ways of gaming anyway. I'll be covering an example of how a board game could be converted, in this case the old SPI Modern Battles Quad game, into a figure gaming format. I suspect this is possibly one of the easiest examples of attempting this feat, and could also be applied to the two sets of World War II quad games SPI published in his scale range. Now, this video has taken quite a while for me to create, simply because I needed to create some custom terrain in order to complete it, as you will soon see. Now, this is not my first attempt at converting a board game into a figure gaming format. The first and oldest is Ancient's Lost Battles board game, which converts very easily due to its very simple game system. The next attempt which I did was converting the SPI Napoleonics quad games and folio games into a figure gaming format. I've created an earlier video covering that attempt in detail, and it will actually contain more basic information about why you should go down this path and what the advantages are, but the focus is primarily Napoleonic warfare. Based on the successes of these two attempts, and the Napoleonic SPI conversion was actually a very good success, I've decided to tackle the Cold War and World War II period. And when I attempted this, I discovered that this actually contains some unique challenges, resulting in a significant change in my earlier thoughts on how you should convert board games to figure gaming. First, I suppose I better define what I mean by board game. I'm specifically talking about a historical board game using a cardboard playing area with a hex grid laid across it and cardboard counters which represent the historical formations or units. The grid, in this case hex-based, is designed to regulate movement and combat. Shown here is the SPI Modern Battles Quad games, both rules and playing areas. I will be mainly focusing on Würzburg, which is shown on the right. Now, a figure game, as the name implies, uses metal or plastic figures based on cardboard or MDF bases instead of cardboard counters, and the playing area does resemble the terrain it's supposed to represent rather than being a map. There are normally no grids or hexes, and terrain, with some minor concession, is supposed to look like a diorama or the diorama of an actual battlefield. There are hybrid games, in this case a big base set of rules, which simply uses large counters and which has a board game-like values printed on them, but with figures placed on them, that is the counters, to make them look pretty. The playing area, while still attempting to be a diorama-like, has a much more regulated and board game-like terrain feel to it. But in this case, we do not have any real grids to regulate movements. Examples of such rules are Kiss Rommel and Megaplitz, as well as a number of other hybrid sets of big base rules. Some board games also attempt to obtain the feel of figure gaming. In this case, the grids are large squares, which are visible but do not clutter the playing area. The counters, like the big battle rules, have a board game-like values printed on them, but they do attempt to look like the troops they're representing. This is a board game, but it looks like a figure game. This example is of Lost Battles, and the only example covering World War II I could find are rules such as Squad Leader on a hex-based playing area with figure-like counters. The advantages of board gaming is, normally, it's easy to set up and quick to play. If we look at the SPI quad games, specifically the Modern Battles games, the playing area is small, the number of counters are typically no more than 100 total, and the number of game turns range from 8 to 12. Players can set up a game in 10 minutes, complete a game within 2 to 3 hours, and pack up in 10 minutes, all on the dining room table. The disadvantages are its abstract nature. As you can see here, the counters do not look like the troops they represent, and the playing area does not look like the terrain the battle is fought over. Modern board gaming does a better job of giving players more of the feel, but it's still basically an abstract experience, with the main focus in understanding what happened in the historical battle and to have a nice, short, competitive game with a clear winner and loser. On the other side, the advantage of figure gaming is if you expend the effort, you get the feel of what it was like being on the battlefield. Figure gaming is, for the most part, all about the feel. Beautiful figures, beautiful playing areas, and with the actual game coming second. For some people, the game itself is almost irrelevant and few games ever end. For other players, a good game is still important, but the primary driver is getting the bling. The disadvantages is that it takes a long time to set up and pack up, and unless some real thought has gone into the actual scenario or game, the game can take too long to complete. While setting up nice figures and a nice playing area a few times without getting a good game can be done a few times, eventually most gamers simply get bored with this process. You do, in the end, need a game which has an end and a winner. One possible solution is to use a board game which uses figures instead of cardboard counters. In this case, figures are being used for a game of lost battles. It is this approach I will kind of cover in this video, although some modifications to the board game was required in order to achieve this. With lost battles, there is no changes to the rules required in order to replace counters with figures. Now, of course, if you decide to deploy a hex grid on the playing area instead of just simply a flat surface, then you can use all the exact same rules. Now, this attempts to minimize the biggest issues with a grid, that is, the lines between them. This looks nice, but for a pure figure gamer who wants the playing area to look as real as possible, the hexes still detracts from the experience. There are other issues with hexes. The GHQ hex system, which can give you some very nice terrain, is really designed for a very small playing area. It can take hours to set up a 4x3 foot playing area, much less anything larger. However, saying that, this is a viable strategy, and gamers can end their search here if they're happy with hexes. Find a board game they like, build up the necessary hex based playing area, and use existing figures and go for it. However, I've tried this in the past and have generally considered it as unsuccessful. But mileage may vary and other players may have a different experience with this. In my earlier video, I go into a lot of detail concerning all the possible options players have available in this area, that is the combination between board gaming and figure gaming. However, instead of repeating all these options, I'll simply skip to the one that I in the end selected, which was a hexless playing area system. My earlier video goes into more details on the other options players have when converting a board game into a figure gaming format, and I would suggest that you view that if you're interested. After a lot of experimentation, I've determined the secret to success is to select a simple game system, as a complex game system offers no benefits over most figure gaming sets of rules. In this case, I selected the Modern Battles Quad, specifically Würzburg. I must have played this game at least 24 times, as it was a popular choice in the board gaming competitions I attended, and I have pleasant memories of the game. One of the scenarios really offers interesting choices for the Soviets, and I adopted a tactic which almost no one else ever used, and basically kept on winning games using it. But in my first game, I was totally wiped out and humiliated, so my tactic was the result of an awful lot of study and playtesting. Part of the reasons why I stopped playing board game competition in the end was that I determined that victory went to the player who did the most training or playtesting, and skill actually became less and less a factor. And it's actually this reason why I've kind of gravitated towards figure gaming, because of its flexible nature. That is, no two games can ever be identical. You do actually need some core basic skill. You can't constantly playtest something down to the level of detail that you would normally do with a board game and then just simply win using this system. If we look at counters, each side commands up to about 50 counters each, with counters representing battalions or in some cases regimental sized formations. The first issue which needs to be resolved is how to represent each counter, either using a single figure or more than one figure or combination of elements. In the end, my preferred method was to have a single element representing a counter, but I did experiment with a 4-element counter unit as well, using a 6 centimeter square movement tray. The one element equals a counter allowed me to create games on a 3x4 foot playing area, but the movement tray system is viable if you wish to increase the playing area to 4 foot by 6 foot or larger. If we first look at the 4-element units, players can simply use movement trays which contain up to 4 elements. In this system, you could allocate a standard value for each element, and the strength of the unit would be a reflection of the number of elements in it. This would also allow you to have step losses for units. One possible issue with the SPI Quad games is that it uses a lossless CRT for the most part. The front line moves forward and backwards based on the strength of each side. Losses can occur, but they are rare. This was my original thought process, this system that is, and in my testing it works quite well, but the playing area needs to be very large, which kind of defeats the objective of having a quick game. I finally adopted the single element unit option in order to keep the playing area to a manageable size. This allows me to have a small playing area and also works well, but means each element has a unique value which needs to be remembered. It was this reason which was why I was not keen on this particular option. However, when I experimented with the 4-element unit, each element still requires a unique value. Once I discovered this, I ended up gravitating towards the 1-element unit system and basically a cheat sheet which tells you what the values of each figures are supposed to be in a game. The fact every figure needed a unique combat and movement value did cause me concern. However, when I really thought about it, many figure game rules do this already, with different vehicles all having different values which require cross-referencing a cheat sheet. But in that case, any specific figure always has the same unique value. So a Tiger 1 always possesses the same value, and you could see a Tiger 1 figure and you knew exactly what it was and how to find its unique values. Thus, every figure on the playing area must have a consistent, even if unique, value. In the game Würzburg, it uses a BMP image to reflect 2 different types of units, as you can see here. In one case, only BMPs were present in the formation, and in the other, some tanks were present, thus the increased attack strength. In this case, players would need 2 different BMP figures to reflect each unit type. Luckily for me, this is not a common thing to occur. In most cases, each type can be represented by a unique figure. In my test game, a BMP1 represented the 1-12 unit, and a BMP2 represented the 3-12 unit. In some cases, I represented the latter with a T-54, T-55 tank. The only real issue that I was left with was infantry. If we look at a German World War II infantry, we quickly discover there's lots of different infantry types. How do we reflect this? I quickly discovered that any infantry with a similar value do not actually need to be differentiated. So then there was no real problem to a large extent. When you really thought about it, infantry probably would have the same combat values. When you look at different periods with different weapons, such as infantry in 39 and grenadiers in 1944, yes, these did have different weapons, and if you actually match them up together, should have different values, but they're not actually ever deployed together. And while the grenadiers have more small arm weapons and more anti-tank, so does everything else around it. So relatively, it still remains the same combat value. You would expect similar types of figures to all pretty much have the same combat and movement values. The tricky aspect is movement, because motorised infantry will have a different movement rate to, let's say, standard infantry. In order to solve this issue, instead of using the actual infantry element, we could depict these units with their transports. Standard motorised infantry would be represented with a truck. Panzer grenadiers in trucks would go into a all-wheel drive vehicle, and Panzer grenadiers in half-tracks would be represented with half-tracks. This could also be applied to cavalry, cycle and motorcycle troops. Finally, I get a chance to use my bicycle-mounted infantry figures. There was one unexpected issue I came across in my construction of army lists, and that was radically different infantry formations which coexisted in the same period. In September 1944, the Germans created ad hoc infantry divisions. The second type of this type of division possessed very little heavy weapons. As a result, those infantry in that particular type of infantry division would have a lesser value, let's say 114 rather than a value of 124. As a result, players may need to have 2 different types of infantry elements to basically allow this to occur. The same thing could also occur with the Russians in 41 to 43, where some of the Russian battalions possess significantly more heavy weapons than others. Other examples of differently composed units would be the early German Panzer battalions, which could be equipped with a wide range of vehicles and have different combat capabilities. Once I thought about it, the differences could be classed as how many tanks were light and how many were medium. The answer to this issue is really twofold. First, many of the differences really do not show up in terms of strength points. Thus, Panzer 1s and Panzer 2s, while different, are not different enough to warrant a different combat value. As a result, we will typically only need a minimum of two categories of units, let's say light and medium tanks, which could also reflect the difference in tank numbers in some circumstances. The only tricky bit is to remember the Panzer II figures are light and the Panzer III are medium Panzer battalions and apply the respective combat values. We also have other type issues with tanks, with each weight class, such as light, medium or heavy, possessing, let's say, two types of combat values. A good example is Panzer IV battalions and Panther battalions in 1944. Other examples in 1933 are Panzer battalions made up of Panzer Is and those made up of Panzer IIs. So while, yes, it's true that Panzer Is and Panzer IIs are both light, and maybe they don't warrant having a different combat value, you may actually consider going down that path regardless. This is normally not a major issue because the vehicles are different. Panzer V, Panzer IVs, Panzer Is and Panzer IIs are all different vehicles, and as long as you know that they're different and they all have different combat and movement values, then you just simply cross-reference your cheat sheet when you engage in combat and movement. We do have another issue, and that is the actual number of weapons or vehicles or whatever's in the unit. SPI Games in Würzburg gives the US forces a large quality advantage. Personally, I prefer reflecting quality using quality rules rather than building it into the counter, for the simple reason quality is subjective. But ignoring this quality aspect for the moment, we see the strengths will vary on the strengths of the actual unit. In my recreation of the Würzburg scenario, I use the SPI values, but in the standard rules that I've created, I arrive at a more deterministic measure of combat strengths. There is one point. This deterministic method, such as 1 attacking SP equals 25 main battle tanks, is actually a relative value. Thus, between periods it can change based on, whatever the convention is during this period. Look, in the end, an awful lot of gut feel is required. Okay, we've covered all the combat strengths. Now let's take a look at element size and how it affects the actual playing area. Basically, in my conversion of the rules, each element size represents the size of the pseudo-hex. Thus, a 3 cm wide element means each pseudo-hex is 3 cm square in size. SPI Quadro games use a map size of 29 by 34 hexes. Ignoring for the moment the difference in size based on the axis that you look at the map, this means when using 3 cm wide elements, the playing area needs to be 87 cm by 102 cm. This fits nicely into a 3 by 4 foot playing area, and I normally expand the map to fit the playing area of this size. If I use my movement tray of 3 elements, or 4 elements, the base size is now 6 cm, which means I need a playing area of 174 cm by 204 cm, which is about 6 feet by 7 feet, which is very large. You could cut out part of the playing area to get this to fit into your playing area of 4 by 6 feet, but any smaller and you change the game dramatically. One advantage of the board game is the pre-battle manoeuvring. There is room for both players to manoeuvre before the battle in order to change the attack thrust or defensive priority. A lot of the game is this pre-battle manoeuvring. However, it's certainly possible to forego this and simply start the game from the moment each side engages with each other. This allows you to reduce the size of your playing area, which makes the 4-element unit viable. As long as deployment and reinforcement details are provided in your scenarios, you can still get a game using this larger unit or size. However, it does cut off the possibility of conducting those large manoeuvring moves. For example, in one scenario, the US forces are holding Würzburg. The Soviets can attack the town as well as outflank the US forces. If you lack the full size of the playing area, this becomes impossible and you are left with only the assault against the town to gain. Saying all that, the large element size is viable, but I have decided to initially focus on the 1 element per unit strategy and thus use the entire map and thus maintain all the pre-battle manoeuvring that is very much part of the actual board game. We'll now actually look at what sort of combat values should we actually apply. We'll take a look at the actual combat values for infantry used in the SPI Quadra games. This shows an example list of the infantry figures for the various games. As much as possible, I've tried to show battalion level units, but for the Chinese this was not possible. For movement, infantry moves at 4 MPs on foot, 6 MPs with some motorised assets, and 12 MPs when fully mounted in an APC. For the most part, the defence strength is 2 and the attack strength is 1. The exceptions are probably due to quality differences, which for now I wish to ignore. I won't bore you with all the calculations I conducted on the original games to derive these values, but basically, using all the values and all the calculations that I conducted, I came to the following guidelines for unit strengths and movement allowances. Okay, what we see here are infantry, 3 types of infantry. Now, type 3 would be the option that could be represented by troop quality rules if you have troop quality rules in your rules. But basically, if we look at these 3 types, we have standard infantry with minimal heavy weapons, which is type A, infantry with standard heavy weapons, which is type B, and special offensive-oriented infantry, such as paratroopers, as type C. The last type would be very rare. These values are for all battalions, which would be the standard unit in my figure gaming set of rules. Now we'll take a look at the armour. Now when I look at armour, I've broken up armour into light, medium and heavy, with 2 types for each weight of armour. This seems to cover most, if all, the comparative differences in any given period. It's possible you may have to expand it, and it's also possible that many of these types would not be used in a particular period or in a particular scenario. Movement rates are provided as a range, although in my scenarios I have fixed on standard World War II movement values and standard Cold War values. Typically World War II is less and Cold War values are greater. Now, one area that I did notice was reconnaissance battalions. Most divisional size formations contained a reconnaissance battalion, which would operate independently and typically would have rather unique values. While there is some overlap with infantry, movement rates probably would be higher, thus they warrant their own group or unit category. Reconnaissance can be on foot, on cavalry or bicycle, motorised or mechanised. You could go overboard, but I have 2 types for each of these 4 movement classes, but I personally feel that that's not required, and these are the only values I typically use in most of my army lists. Now we come to the other kind of battalions that were normally attached, such as anti-tank battalions, assault guns and tank destroyer battalions. Now you could assume that these assets were merged in with the rest of the division, but this can cause some unusual issues. Such, for example, divisions with these assets would need basically infantry and armour values which are different for everything else. So as a result, I feel that these need to be included in the divisional structure to reflect those heavily equipped divisions. That way it doesn't affect the values of the basically core units within the division. Now, the anti-tank and tank destroyer units would have a special defence against attacks by enemy tanks, thus the asterisk next to the defensive strength. The rule I use is its defensive value is doubled if attacked by tanks. The final is assault guns such as Stuk-3 and Soviet ISU-122 and ISU-152s. These are similar to tank destroyers but lack that special benefit against tanks. They are more focused on supporting infantry to break through a defensive position. This covers pretty much most of the battalion-sized formations used in the division. Some divisions had a large number of company-sized formations which could be consolidated into one of these battalion-sized formations. Now we need to deal with artillery. I've basically broken up into 4 basic groupings with long-range guns and rocket artillery battalions added at the end. Obviously, artillery battalions normally only consist of 12 to 18 guns rather than 30 to 60 tanks, but as long as the combat strengths reflect this, then it's not an issue. The same issue occurs with tank destroyers and anti-tank guns. Now, in the SPI Quad games, they often deploy regiments of artillery and give them higher values accordingly. Basically, for my World War II series, I personally feel that we're better off staying with battalion and just giving it sufficiently low values. Now that we have some values, we can determine some ratios between strengths and tank numbers. Let's look at a 1943 German Panzer battalion, which consists of 88 Panzer IIIs and Panzer IV tanks. A possible ratio in this period is for every 20 tanks you have 1 attack strength point and a half a defence strength point. In September 1944 the number of tanks dropped to 42 tanks, so the ratio would need to change. For comparison, a US tank battalion consisted of 54 medium tanks and 17 light tanks, so this would imply the German battalion should be weaker. This level of fine-tuning would need to be resolved by the scenario details, as it would be impossible to cover all possible options. One advantage of the 4-element units is the strength difference could be reflected by simply placing 3 elements in a German unit and 4 elements in a US unit. However, if you are preparing for a simpler experience, then just don't worry too much about this. A point system will compensate for any issues in the area, and creating a historical scenario will uncover any issue during playtesting. One other option that I'm looking at, which I haven't implemented yet, is that I take a division and simply count up everything and then just divide by the numbers of vehicles and weapons to arrive at my units. In this case, I don't end up with battalions. I end up with a pseudo percentage of, let's say, all the tanks in the division. It's certainly an option, and I use this for, let's say, Napoleonics, but for those players who want to command battalions and have a feel that they've got a division or regiment within the division, then probably just basically go for the simple process and just assume numbers are all approximately the same. Okay, now we need to look at the actual game mechanics. Specifically, how do we replace hexes? Apart from the hex issue, the rules pretty much are much the same as the original board game. For movement, we can use the same MP allowances as the board game, but instead of hexes, they represent base widths. So a movement allowance of 12 means a 3 cm wide unit can move 36 centimeters. If using a 6 centimeter wide element or unit, this becomes 72 centimeters. The final part is the trickiest, how to actually replace hexes and zones of control. The method I use is to use the concept of movement zones of control, which are used to lock units together for movement, and combat zones of control, which determine the mandatory combat rules. A movement zone of control extends half a base width in all directions from a unit. On the left, we have the most common size single element units and their movement zones of control. On the right, we see a 4-element unit with movement zones of control which extend 3 centimeters or half of 6 centimeters in all directions. When any enemy element unit touches a friendly movement zones of control, its movement stops and it's locked in place. Now in the rules there's some minimal pivoting, which the rules explains why, but basically that's your locked zone of control, or how you achieve the locked zone of control without the use of hexes on the playing area. Now the defender can create a defensive line with elements just under 2 bases width apart from each other, which would stop enemy units from passing through. In the board game counters, we can have 1 or 2 hex gaps between each other. This is reflected with the movement zones of control. In this particular case, we have basically a 2 hex gap between, which is, possible, and it stops enemy units from moving through, but it's a very weak defensive line. Optimally, you'd probably want these movement zones of control to be touching, which is the equivalent of having a 1 hex gap between units. And finally, if all the units are physically, basically, or in edge-to-edge contact with each other, that's what represents a defensive line where you basically have a unit in every single hex. Now we come to the tricky bit. Once a phasing unit is in an enemy movement zone of control, it now has a combat zone of control, which extends 1 base width in all directions. Any phasing unit in an enemy movement zone of control must attack all units that are within its combat zone of control. In this case, if the white unit was currently in the phasing combat phase, it would need to attack all 3 enemy units, as they are all in its combat zones of control. If the grey units were the phasing combat phase, only 1 would need to attack, as the other 2 are not in an enemy movement zones of control. This, with some changes, reflects the compulsory combat rules of the original board game and seems to work quite adequately. Let's look at a combat example. In this example, the phasing white player would use Unit A to attack the opposing Unit X and Y, with Unit B and Unit C combining to attack enemy element or Unit Z. Units D and W face off against each other. A player may wish to do this to break through the centre. while they do not care about being forced to retreat back on, let's say, some of the flanks. This order could be changed and the attacker could actually attack in a totally different way depending on what they actually want to achieve. But let's just go with this particular attack, which is the white player wants to break through in the centre. This shows a possible result after combat. On the left, the white lost, so it retreated one base width back, with the enemy advancing after combat. In the centre, the white player won, with one unit advancing after combat, and finally on the right, the white player has won and advanced accordingly. The order of attacks become critical, as it may become possible to surround a unit and cause it to be eliminated if it was forced to retreat. Now, this, of course, depends on how the combat or the combat order is conducted, and of course, what actual combat results arise. In my version of the game, I use the combat results table from the original Modern Battles rules, and it's basically unchanged. If using the 4-element unit option, the CRT could be modified to provide some attrition casualties, allowing for units to be attritioned away. Examples could include players could always have the option to take 1 element loss for any single retreat of 1 base width. But all my playtesting uses the original CRT with no modifications because I use the 1 element unit option, and this CRT works quite adequately in that particular case. And because this comes from a board game, for all intents and purposes, there is no flank or rear modifiers. And actually, this is reflected by the inability to retreat through enemy movement zones of control, rather than actually having special modifiers. In this case, if the white unit was forced to retreat, it would be eliminated, as it cannot retreat through an enemy movement zones of control and retreat directly away from its attacker. This is because the opposing edges that have of the unit's movement zones of control have enemy units up against them. Now, if the opposing edges of your unit does not have enemy units against it, then there is always a path to retreat. In this case, the white unit has enemy units to its front and left flank. It could retreat left and to its rear. In a lossless system, the only way to break through is to eliminate units via the use of surrounds, and also the active CRT can be used as well. I have no strong preferences for a basically lossless system. It makes sense if you're using single strength units, and I must admit in the Modern Wars game, Quadra game, unlike the Napoleonics, there is something called the active CRT which does have more casualties. On the other hand, losing a whole part of the front line due to a lucky die roll would be rather destabilising and annoying for a player. Breaking through a front line due to overwhelming odds, which is possible, is actually probably much the better solution. A lossless system in this case basically works. However, if you were to use a 4-element unit, which is another valid option, then some form of losses in combat would also make some sense, so you could simulate attrition. In my Napoleonic conversion, which uses 4-element units, I've done this, but in this case I've mainly focused on the 1-element unit, and as such I will stay with the original SPI combat system because I know it works. Part of my conversion of the SPI Quadra games was to actually duplicate the original maps into a playing area format. This shows my template for the Würzburg board game map. Using this I can create a 3 by 4 foot playing area. The Soviets come in from the left and the US forces from the right. This shows the initial forces for what I consider is the most interesting scenario in the board game Würzburg. The US forces have to hold Würzburg, which the Soviet forces have to take. This shows the end of a typical first game turn, at least the Soviet game turn. Depending on the combats, the bulk of the US forces will be locked in place, thus allowing the forces, the Soviet forces on the left, to cross the river and attempt to outflank the US forces. Of course, the US receives reinforcements on game turn 2, allowing it to possibly keep the road open until further reinforcements arrive. The game is one of constant reinforcements being fed into the battle for many of the game turns, ensuring a seesaw battle of wits. This type of scenario takes a lot of effort and fine-tuning to create, and while it can work in a board game, it often does not work in a figure game. The reason is the terrain is rarely exactly the same as the playtest terrain when you create the scenario. This raises an interesting point. In these types of games, the major factor is actually terrain. Force mix matters, but it's the terrain which gives us our historically accurate key factor. In figure gaming, terrain is significant, but it's mainly about the force mix. There are many reasons for this, but the most important is the scale. What we see here are lots of minor conflicts between regimental-sized groupings of battalions. You can have a 4-to-1 advantage in any one of these conflicts by simply manoeuvring your forces correctly. In a typical figure gaming brigade versus brigade conflict, this just simply doesn't occur. Now let's look at the actual playing area I've created. Using the template on the left, I have used two 3mm MDF sheets and basically painted the water features on it and important roads. The MDF boards get flocked and the terrain features are placed on it, as you can see on the right. It'll never be perfect, which is why reproducing a board game with all its nuanced detail is basically not possible. However, we can get to the point where we can actually get an interesting game. In my example game, I'm refighting the Siege of Würzburg scenario, which is basically all about Würzburg, which is shown here. The US has a small force defending it when the Soviets sweep down from the north. This shows the US initial deployment, at least the deployment that I've selected. My apologies for the figures. I've packed all my US Cold War forces away and have been forced to use my West German figures instead because that has not been packed away. The US mech infantry battalions are fortified, which gives them a bonus shift to 4, which is a powerful defence. The only issue is that they need to stay in place, that is, they can't move around. There is no way the US can hold the whole city, so they are only defending the southern bank. The tank battalions are in the rear, ready to counterattack or move out to deal with any outflanking. The self-propelled howitzer battalions are in the rear, ready to provide supporting fire. This gives you the board game, a top-down view of the deployment. Just a quick note here, you can see the roads do cross the river. In the game, all the bridges have been destroyed. The reason why I've decided to actually put these bridges in is because I intend to use this for other games where we don't have a situation where all the bridges are automatically destroyed at the beginning of the game. For my first test game using my new playing area terrain, I'm actually using the original rules and cheat sheets and CRTs, etc., etc. It's that much of a close copy of the original board game. We now move to the end of the Soviet movement phase on game turn 1. This is the position at that particular point in time. The basic tactic that the Soviets are undertaking is outflanking the US while pinning down the US forces in Würzburg. This is not a common tactic in this scenario, but it's the one I often use as it confuses my opponent. As there are only 8 game turns, there is a risk I will not achieve my evil Soviet objectives using this, but if I do, it'll be a decisive victory. Unfortunately, I've packed away all my good Soviet figures. Only my second-grade figures are available for this battle. I'm focusing on World War II these days, so my Cold War stuff is not commonly available for my playtest sessions, unfortunately. This is a top-down view of the actual front line where combat will occur. What I'm initially intending to do is basically to either pin down the American forces in the centre so they can't cover the flanks, and also dislodging the American mech forces that have the 4 bonus. So what I've done here is that all my high attack strength units are going to be attacking the 3 American units in Würzburg across the river. Now behind the front line I have 4 units of indirect fire weapons. The artillery has a range of 9 base widths or 27 centimetres, which means they are in range of the entire front line. The same applies with the rocket artillery, which has a lesser range but are still within range. Out of range of this image is the US 2 self-propelled howitzer battalions. They are in range and they can provide a FPF or fire protection fire of 2 strength points each. In the first attack, the Soviets attack with 6 SPs, that's 3 units, each with 3, against 2 SPs, that's the American defenders. The difference is +4. The US is in a town, which gives it 2 shifts, and it has a fortified bonus, which gives it a total of 6 shifts, reducing the odds to -6. Now it's also behind the river, but in these rules you only get 1 terrain modifier, and the river modifier is shift 2, as is occupying a town. The US player has 4 FPF points, which he will hold back in this case. If he allocated the 2 FPF, the common would drop to -7, which means there is a 1 in 3 chance of the attacker being eliminated. As there is still a 1 in 6 chance of the attacker being eliminated, so it's a pretty big risk by the Soviets. And actually, I made an error here. I should have actually basically put down at least some bombardment against that unit to ensure that there was no chance of my units being eliminated. The Soviets spin a 2 on the active CRT and suffer an A1, so they have to retreat 1 base width. The US could advance after combat, but it would lose its bonus, and if forced to retreat would be eliminated, as you cannot retreat across the river. So it basically stays put, which is basically what the Soviets expected. The Soviets launched a similar attack in the centre, but to avoid the chance of being eliminated, allocate 1 bombardment of 3 points, which gives it a differential of +6, which drops to -2 after you apply the -6 shift. In this case, the US wants to avoid the chance of a both repeat, so drops an FPF of 2 onto the defender. The difference is now -4. The result will be an A1 no matter what the Soviets spin. Now, the reason why the Soviets launch such weak attacks on their left flank is the main effort is on the right flank. They have 6 SPF from the mech battalions and 8 from the 2 rocket artillery battalions and 3 from the artillery battalion for a total of 17 SPs. The US has 2 SPs and drops the last 2 FPF onto it, given a strength of 4 SPs. The difference is +15, which puts it on the +12 column. We shift left 6 columns, which gives us a final column of 0. The Soviets spin a 2, which is an exchange. The US element is eliminated, and 1 Soviet element is eliminated, and the remaining element advances after combat. This is the front line at the end of the Soviet game turn. As we can see, the retreat of the 4 elements, 1 is lost and 1 has advanced after combat over the river, locking the American tank in place. In order to make the front line a bit clearer for people to see, the red line represents the Soviet movement zones of control, and the light blue, the US players' movement zones of control. 2 opposing units are locked in each other's movement zone of control and cannot move during any of their respective phasing movement phases. During the US player turns, the US player receives reinforcements on game turn 1, which allows it to shore up the flank and the critical road to Würzburg, but they will need to counter-attack and force the Soviet unit back. As you can see, the US has to send the SPH, or self-propelled howitzer battalions, into the front line, which I'm not sure how historical that is, but there's no alternative in this particular case. Anyway, the US counterattacks with 3 SPs, supported by 2 barrage SPs, against the Soviet 2 SPs. The Soviet will spend their 2 FPF points, they get 1 each from their artillery regiments or battalions to support it. So the differential is +1. Shift 2, because the Soviet unit is in a town, and we end up with a row of, or column of -1. I actually made an error here and forgot about the Soviet FPF, so I spun a 2 on the +1, which was a D1, which meant the Soviets retreated 1 base width. I made another error and retreated over the river. I should have retreated into the woods, as retreating over a river results in an elimination. Regardless, if I had remembered about the Soviet FPF, the American counterattack would not have been successful in forcing it out of the town. Anyway, this is one of the issues when you play a game for the first time, even if you knew the game extremely well many years ago. Ignoring the fact that I made these 2 errors, this is the front line after that. The US, in this particular case, has stabilised its front line just. If the errors had not been made, the Soviets would still be in the town at the other end, which would have caused the Americans no end of trouble. Now we move to a game turn 2. This is the end of the Soviet second game turn movement phase. I made another error here and mixed up game turn 1 and game turn 3 reinforcements. My game turn chart was not wisely designed, and I will almost certainly redesign it accordingly. First game in a long time, so I suppose you could expect these errors. This is one reason why having a simple game system is so important. Errors occur even with a simple game system. When it's too complex, errors become the norm and players win based on rules knowledge, not actual gaming skill. which is a major issue with many figure gaming rules unless all players know those rules absolutely backwards. Let's now take a look at the Soviet attacks on game turn 2. The Soviets will be launching 5 attacks. I'll not cover all attacks in any great detail, but all pretty much results in an A1 except for one. The yellow circles indicate artillery. As one US artillery battalion is being attacked, it cannot contribute FPF, so can't be used in this particular manner. It should be noted, attacks are compulsory. Any enemy unit within a combat zone of control must be attacked. This actually shows what I mean. The red line indicates the combat zone of control. As you can see here, the Soviet units which are in the movement zone of control of enemy, which are those 8 units that you see here with arrows leading from them, when you actually trace out their combat zones of control, the combat zones of control include 5 American units. All 5 must be attacked, and this shows you the order of their attacks. This is the result after the combat. All units have retreated. However, the Soviets did get to cross in one particular spot. The red line is the Soviet movement zone of control in this case. You'll notice on the right there are only 3 tank battalions. One was lost in an AX result and the other result was a BR result. Now the purpose of that flank attack was not really to make many advances, it was mainly to basically tie down American forces. One thing I did notice when I was creating this video, when I actually made these photographs, I took photos from all sorts of different angles. I think in future, when I'm trying to show you what occurs in terms of advance, retreats and combats, I'll just pick a single angle and just keep on taking a photograph from that same angle, which will make it a little bit easier. So my apologies for this sort of wild movement all over the place. Anyway, this shows the position at the end of the Soviet game turn 3 movement phase. Look, I've made many errors in the playing of this game, but in the whole, this is probably roughly where you'd expect to be. The US holding out in Würzburg in a desperate battle to keep the road open so reinforcements can charge up to reinforce Würzburg. During game turn 3, the Soviets are launching a lot of attack, most of which are only designed to pin down US units. The US player has significantly more FPF, so the Soviets need to be very careful and must ensure they present that they create so many attacks, any FPF response is muted or neutralized. Next game turn, the US gets 6 air support points, which will make any Soviet effort even harder. Now, as you can imagine, the importance of FPF is that when you've actually launched your attack, the enemy can drop FPF down there and wildly swing the odds to a very bad result, which can cause a bit of a disaster. That is the importance of FPF and even air support points. This shows the position at the end of the entire game turn 3. Most of the pinning attacks on the left resulted in a Russian retreat, but the tank battalion had managed to cut off the road, as you can see in the centre. A US counterattack freed it up again, but only just by 1 to 4 millimetres. Why is this important? If the Soviet movement zone of control extended into the road, then the American reinforcements that came off the edge would not be able to charge straight up into Würzburg. And charging straight up into Würzburg is pretty important if the Americans are attempting to beat off a Soviet attack across the river. At this stage of the game, the Soviets' main hope is outflanking Würzburg on its right side. But the Soviets do need more reinforcements in order for this to occur, which they will actually receive. As soon as the US can form any form of reserves, the Soviets will not be able to advance and the game will be basically over. Unless, of course, they'd already cut off Würzburg, in which case they've won the game. This shows the movement zones of control. You'll see gaps in the Soviet line. The US could pump units through, the one gap that they could get a unit through, but the Soviets would simply have a field day destroying these units. Now, the Americans also have a few gaps, but if you look very carefully, none of those gaps are wide enough to allow for a single element to get right through. I'll not continue with the game, but the result was a US victory. That is, the US managed to hold on to any part of Würzburg, and there was a supply line leading off the edge to it, so it wasn't surrounded. Now, I must admit I made a lot of critical errors in the first 3 game turns, which may have had a major impact on the final result. At least that's what I suspect. Now look, I have to admit, this particular scenario is a rather special scenario, and it's unlikely any standard game would provide a similar gaming experience. But even in an ad hoc style of game, as long as the force mixes are uneven, you could achieve an interesting seesawing game, with the result being unknown until close to the end of the game, which is really what it's all about, that is, keeping the excitement up right up to the end. Now, the other issue with a scenario like this is the playing area. This requires a custom playing area, and generally this is not practical. I also had issues with this playing area idea. The playing area is made up of 2 sheets of 3mm MDF, but the surface, the MDF surface does bend, and when you join up the MDF boards, they often do not join in a clean manner. My preference is a more universal terrain system, which may not look as good, especially the rivers, but still achieves the objective of creating a good playing area. My standard playing area boards are more rigid and are either a single piece or join up in a clean manner. Now, I must admit, I could have actually used a single 3x4 foot MDF sheet, which is viable, and just simply created the entire Würzburg map on it. And probably that's what I should have done. But the trouble with a 3x4 sheet like that is, where do you store it, or how do you store it? I could probably store a few of them, but once I get beyond a couple, forget it. It's just simply not practical. Anyway, something I may consider. I think I may actually go back and get a 3x4 piece of MDF and put the Würzburg map, or some map of some description on it, which I think is interesting. Because, the one advantage of this is I do think this looks better than using a standard playing area. When I created my Napoleonic conversion of an SPI board game into a figure gaming game, I created 2 versions. The first version was a close copy of all the board games in the SPI series. In the second, I totally rewrote the rules in such a manner which would be more familiar to figure gamers, as well as adding a lot of optional rules to add typical figure gaming flavour. If you exclude all these optional rules, you still end up with the same experience as the direct copy of the board game. But the scenarios are all more generic and use standard playing area building blocks. Incidentally, if you wish to download any of the rules, this shows you the link where I currently have the copy of the Modern Battles under Schwerpunkt in the IO Group Schwerpunkt site. Just to show you an example, if we look at my Napoleonic conversion and look at the Battle of Leipzig, the playing area on the left is from my version 1, and it copies the board game map very closely. The version on the right is from my version 2, which uses generic building blocks terrain. I use felt water features and standard size area terrain pieces, most of which are 6 by 12 centimetres for Napoleonic, 5 by 10 centimetres for World War II and Modern, and of course the built-up areas are basically the element width square. While the details can vary, the general course of the battle, of which I've only gamed day 1 in this particular case, is much the same in either playing area. So, in terms of gaming experience, the generic playing area still achieves what you want to achieve. Just doesn't quite look so good because, quite frankly, felt rivers don't look as good as embedded rivers, which are nice and glossy and watery. If we come back to my Neue Schwerpunkt set of rules, which covers World War II and Modern games, this shows the playing area for one of the scenarios, in this case the Second Battle of Kharkov. This uses normalised historical reinforcements, with the Russians attacking for half the game and the Germans counter-attacking in the second half. While the playing area and force mixes are not exactly correct, they generally give me a game experience similar to history, or at least similar to the SPI board game Kharkov in this particular sector of the battlefield anyway. This concludes part 39 of my video series on game design theory, in this case using a board game for figure gaming and what may be required to make it work. Denken Sie daran, immer für die Heimatland zu kämpfen.